Well, it's 2 o'clock, so I am going to get going. We have a good amount to cover. We can close it. Okay. Let's see if folks trip on the back. Well, good afternoon, guys. Thanks for joining me. I was just saying, I'm very thrilled to be talking about Cuba because it is so relevant today. So the way I structured this, I actually wanted to take a few minutes just to talk about what we're doing on the international scale. I've kind of framed this very much as Cuba relates to the United States. We'll go through a lot of the history of Cuba, but I really want to talk about what's happening kind of at a global scale and what in particular this administration is doing with international affairs just generally. So this administration has been doing some crazy stuff throughout the world, and we've been threatening all of our neighbors, and we've been starting wars in Iraq, and we've been deposing dictators in Venezuela, and I kind of just think that on the surface level it doesn't make a whole ton of sense. So I wanted to talk about what I see as sort of the strategy that is going forward in the current international affairs, especially as it relates to the United States. So for the past, 50 or 60 years, the world has been extremely globalized, and we've been moving far more into a globalized economy. In a globalized economy, what you have is rampant specialization of economies. And that just means that all of the economies can focus on the goods and resources that they have, and their competitive advantage will allow them to trade on an international market, and everybody benefits from this idea of if, Iran is producing oil, people will buy the oil, and then Iran needs a car, and they can turn to South Korea and get the car. And so this is the idea of a globalized economic model. And this is what a lot of administrations in recent years, in the past few administrations, have been leaning into. We've wanted to see a more free market. We've wanted to see more advantages for everybody in the free market. Theoretically, this is the best way to go. But this is just a theory. And that kind of approach to an economic model has a lot of pitfalls built into it. Because as, the United States, we don't necessarily control what happens in all of those countries throughout the world, right? If any one of these countries goes down that we are dependent on, then we have a problem, right? If we are getting rubber from this country and then this country falls into civil war and we can't get rubber anymore, that means we can't make tires, and we find a lot of different problems. So the theory here, and very much the mindset of this administration, is to control your own resources, to be able to extend ourselves such that we have full autonomous control over what happens in this country and all of the resources that we are going to need. We then avoid all of those problems, right? We avoid the problems of other countries because we have control over what is actually happening. So this is particularly relevant for this continent. This has not been a formal declaration by any stretch, but they are calling this the Don Roe Doctrine of the Donald and James Monroe portmanteau. So Donald Trump has been threatening Greenland. He's been threatening Canada. He's been threatening Cuba. He's been talking about Mexico. And this is what he's talking about. He's talking about controlling all of North America. He wants to get into Venezuela because he wants to be able to control Venezuelan oil, right? If we control that oil, then we have resource efficiency and resource independence. So this has been kind of the prevailing theory going forward. So what we see when we look at this kind of model is that the United States likely wants to control the Western Hemisphere. And this has been a major focus of the United States since 1823, when the Monroe Doctrine was passed. We wanted to keep all of Europe out of any of the Americas. We wanted to keep the Soviet Union out of the Americas. And we want to plant our flag in all of the resources that the Western Hemisphere has to offer. If we can control all of this, then we will be the most powerful country in the world. We are already the most powerful country in the world, but we are extremely dependent on other countries and what happens in those countries. So this is the operating theory. And this is why you are hearing so much conversation about military action throughout the hemisphere and throughout the world. We are focused on consolidating the power that comes with this massive landmass that we have. The United States, being what it is almost untouchable. This is the biggest advantage that the United States has, is that we have two oceans on either side of us. The only ways to be able to attack the United States is from the north or the south, and we have pretty good allies there, or we're going to annex them. So if we can control all of this, then nobody can get to us. Very few countries have missiles that can hit the United States from here, from here, from here, from anywhere, if we control everything in North America. So this is a very, very war hawk theory of governance, that we believe that we need to control all of these things. We need to use military power to be able to control these things. And here's the reason. Because globalization is happening, and because the world is so interconnected on an economic and trade level right now, we have a lot of kind of perils and pitfalls within the system, right? If any one of these countries fails, then that threatens the United States economy, and that is what we want to avoid. This is all of the major choke points that happen in the United States, and we're seeing why we're doing this right now with the Strait of Hormuz, right? When the Strait of Hormuz is closed, the rest of the world suffers. Most of the world does not have great access to oil in this moment because this choke point is shut down. If any of these choke points in the world get shut down, we face similar situations. It could be oil, it could be food, it could be any other kind of resource that we're thinking about. So all of these points, it's very important for now that they stay open and that they stay free, so that all countries can benefit from the trade that passes through these points. But, if you do have a rogue actor like Iran, for example, who wants to shut down one of these global choke points, then the entire global economy suffers. And this is what Donald Trump and his administration would like to avoid on a theoretical level, is that we wouldn't have to rely on all of the trade that goes through these channels, because we would control all of this. If you control all of this, then you don't need the rest of the world nearly as much. So we are pivoting backwards in many senses into a sense of control. And this is why we are talking about invading Greenland. And this is why we are talking about invading Canada. And this is why we are talking about invading Cuba. We would likely, within this system, return to an old model that we had in international affairs, which is a spheres of influence sort of model. It's a geographic model where all of the land masses control the surrounding land masses, and there's less dependence on trade going in between these countries because these are all controlled by these countries. So this is kind of what this looks like right now. The United States already controls much of the Western Hemisphere. We already have a big control in Australia, but we are alienating Australia and we are alienating Europe in these moments. By taking some of these unilateral actions to control the Western Hemisphere, we're alienating a lot of our allies in Europe and in the rest of the world. So this seems to be a trade-off that Donald Trump and the administration are willing to make, that we weaken our alliances for the sake of territorial control. This is a huge gamble. This is a huge power play. This is going to require a ton of money, and it's going to require offending a ton of people, and it's going to require some of these crazy actions that we have been doing over the past year or so. And we'll see, and the idea is that this will keep progressing. This is why Donald Trump talks about taking over Cuba incessantly. We have new conversations about what is happening in Greenland as of yesterday. Mexico is becoming a little bit testier of an ally, and we will talk to them, but we've talked about annexing Canada as the 51st state. Donald Trump has been posting pictures of Venezuela with an American flag draped over it and talking about making them the 51st state. Right? All of these things ladder up to this, to control of the Western Hemisphere. And this is what we are pushing for. So I just wanted to tee that up as we talk about Cuba, because Cuba is going to be a huge part of this. Cuba is right here. Cuba is extremely close to the United States. It may not have all of the resources in the world that we want, But it does represent an existential threat to the United States because it is so close to us. We need to be able to both control the resources here as well as the security considerations that go into this kind of equation. And Cuba has always been a thorn in our side when it comes to that, or at least that's how we have typically thought of it. So this is Cuba. Cuba is only 90 miles from Key West. That is a shorter distance than Denver to Pueblo. Denver to Pueblo is 112 miles. So Cuba is extremely, extremely close to Florida. And this is why the United States has such a fixation with Cuba. Because if Cuba is not an ally of the United States, it does not have far to go to attack the United States. This was the big deal in the Cuban Missile Crisis, was that missiles were extremely close to the United States and that we wouldn't have the ability to react to an attack coming from one of these countries. So we're going to talk about the history of Cuba, and we're going to talk about the predicament that they find themselves in, and we're going to talk about what likely comes next in this whole debate. So Cuba is about the size of Tennessee. I forget the square mileage here, but it is about the size of Tennessee. It is 11 million people in population. That population is shrinking by the day as people are fleeing the country, as people are passing away within the country. They have an extremely old population. The median age in Cuba is 41 years old. Their birth rate is at negative 0.5%. So they are a population in decline, and it seems to be getting worse and worse by the day as they sort of run out of power and as they sort of run out of resources and things. It's very multiracial. Cuba is kind of a mix of the indigenous people who were there, as well as the slaves that were imported into Cuba and the Europeans that landed there. All of the Cubans pretty much consider themselves Afro-Cuban. So it's almost entirely mixed race. Their primary exports, they have a great reserve of nickel. So they actually have a pretty robust mining industry as it pertains to nickel. And nickel is a very important metal. They also rely very heavily on tourism. Tourism not from the United States, but tourism from Europe, tourism from Latin America, tourism from all these other places. I always forget that the rest of the world can go to Cuba, because I can't. And then I talk to somebody from, the Netherlands who tells me what a great trip they had in Cuba. I go, you guys can go to Cuba? That's crazy. And then they have a huge agricultural industry. So they control a lot of the world's sugar. They have historically controlled a lot of the world's sugar, and tobacco are their primary resources. But it's a pretty, it's not necessarily underdeveloped as a nation, but it's not a significant economic trading partner for any major country. What they have, primarily, and what they have had, is a great positioning within the world. I'm going to show you this real quick. Cuba has always been a huge prize. Whether you're a colonist, or whether you're the United States, or whether you're a revolutionary, Cuba is situated in the Caribbean. And the Caribbean has historically controlled access to both North America and South America. Almost all goods that were coming either out of South America back over to Spain or to European colonies went through Cuba. Everything that goes out of the United States goes through Cuba. The things that come into the United States should theoretically go through Cuba, though they don't. And all of these things go through Cuba to Latin America. And that's very much true of the mercantile era, of the time where ships were our only real trading solution. So Cuba has always had a strategic importance more than an economic importance because it is so aptly located. That sets the stage for the beginnings of what we call modern Cuban history. So in 1492, Columbus landed on Cuba. Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and he landed in Cuba. And he called it one of the most beautiful places in the world. And he very much recognized its strategic importance. He had, of course, thought that he was landing in the Indies, and he was, of course, very misinformed as he did that. But the Spanish invaded from 1492. They quickly took over in about 1512. Prior to the Spanish invasion, there was an indigenous people. They were called the Taipo or the Taipo people. And they were nearly entirely wiped out by disease when the Europeans arrived. When the Europeans arrived, about 85% of their population was decimated in the next 2 or 3 decades. They really, really suffered at the hands of European disease more than anything, but European settlers also fought the Taipo to take over Cuba. They were a very peaceful people, a very spiritual people. They had no concept of land ownership, and they existed very peacefully, kind of in the forests of Cuba until the Spanish arrived. But the Spanish arrived, and they immediately recognized it as an extremely, extremely important port because it controlled access to Florida, which was a key area for them, as well as Latin America, which was going to grow in importance over the next century or so. So Cuba has always been extremely important to colonists. Cuba was particularly important in the slave trade. Nearly all of the slaves that went either into the United States or went into Latin America came through Cuba first. And this is why they have such a dense Afro-Cuban population. At one time, Cuba was home to about 800,000 slaves. For context, the United States only imported 400,000 slaves from the transatlantic slave trade. So Cuba had one of the largest slave populations in the world. When the Taipo died, they kind of left these sugar plantations, they left the sugar cane, and the Spanish very quickly recognized what a valuable resource sugar cane was. But they had no labor. They had no indigenous labor because all of the indigenous labor had died off due to disease. So it was very important for them to be able to import labor into Cuba. And that's why Cuba has such a robust enslaved population for much, much, much of its history. So Cuba existed as a colony of Spain for about 400 years, and it was very much a slave colony. There were very kind of wealthy landowners who lived in Cuba, and they owned their slaves, and that was a lot of the population. And they exported in large part tobacco, and they exported in large part sugarcane. It was one of the largest sugarcane producers in the world for much of its history, and Spain loved it for it. Spain loved sugarcane. There was a great dependence upon sugar in Europe, and Cuba was the bastion of it. So, in the turn of the 19th century, the late 1800s, late 1700s, early 1800s, there are a series of revolutions in the Americas. We have the Bolivarian Revolution taking place down south in Venezuela, in Colombia, in Ecuador. Bolivar is moving through the continent to free the people of the continent from Spanish rule. We have the Haitian Slave Revolution in about 1803, where they overthrew the French colonists in Haiti, and it was a slave revolution. I mean, people were very scared of the slave revolution in Cuba. And we have the American Revolution that happens in 1776 and ongoing into the early 1800s. So everybody's looking at Cuba at this point in their history, and they're saying, are they going to be part of this revolutionary wave? Do they have the same kind of impetus that these other countries have during this era? And the answer is yes and no. They don't necessarily take off with this wave, but they very much ride the back of this wave. They exist for about 50 more years under colonial rule. Again, it's a strong merchant class. There's not a lot of will to defy the Spanish because most of the merchants are getting rich off the Spanish anyway, and they're getting rich selling the sugarcane from their plantations and their tobacco plantations. So Spain does maintain control throughout this kind of revolutionary period. But the United States is starting to take shape. And the Cubans now face a little bit more of a predicament. The Cubans now find themselves under Spanish rule and with an empire rising to the north. And this is very scary for small states. So when you have superpowers all around you, you're kind of anticipating being invaded or taken over in any same state. So the United States starts to look to Cuba, and we start to see both the economic viability of Cuba as well as the security viability of Cuba. And our first attempt to actually purchase Cuba was in 1848. James Polk tried to purchase Cuba in 1848. There was kind of whispers of a revolution at this time, and James Polk said, you don't have to deal with this revolution, Spain. We'll take it off your hands, and I'll give you $100 million for it. They did not take us up on that offer, and they remained a Spanish colony. But very quickly after that, we start to see revolutions taking shape in Cuba. The first of these revolutions was the 10 Years' War, which happened from 1868 to 1878. The 10 Years' War, it was caused by this man. He was a wealthy merchant, and he was also a politician in Cuba. And he had this very, very famous speech on the Cuban parliamentary floor, where he freed his own slaves, and he called for the freedom of all slaves in Cuba, and he called for all sorts of land reform and land redistribution. It was an extremely progressive, revolutionary moment. And that speech alone spurred guerrilla movements throughout the entirety of Cuba, and slaves started to revolt. Slaves were equipped with machetes to take care of the sugarcane and to take care of the tobacco, and that's in large part how this war was fought. They took to the woods and they took to the mountains, and they took with their machetes and they ambushed the Spanish. The Spanish had much better artillery. They had much better military equipment. They had much better military personnel. And the only way to ever fight an empire like that is to have a guerrilla war. So everybody took to the mountains. Everybody took to the forests, and they hid and they ambushed the Spanish periodically. And it was a really, really sticky situation for the Spanish. Ultimately, the Spanish are successful in quelling this revolution. They send about 20,000 soldiers over to Cuba, and they quell the revolution. But the revolution very much still lives on, and it's mostly failed as a result of the fact that it was disorganized. They did not have a cohesive movement as they went into that revolution. It was mostly that all of these people found themselves inspired, and they heard that other people were taking to the mountains, and so they took to the mountains themselves. They didn't necessarily coordinate any of their attacks. They weren't coordinated on their issues. It was a very disjointed revolutionary movement. But the whispers and the flames of the revolution are alive and well. In 1886, they abolished slavery, finally, in Cuba. And this was a huge deal in Cuba because it liberated all of the population, more or less. So many people in Cuba at that time were slaves, and now they had the right to vote, they had the right to own property, they had a lot of different rights. And this was part of a compromise that the Spanish were trying to make with the revolutionaries. They were saying, we want to accede to some of your demands, but we don't want to give you everything. Why don't we abolish slavery? Why don't we have some sorts of reforms? And we're going to try to appease the population. But that's not necessarily what happened. Because just a few years later, we're going to actually see the beginnings of the revolution. So in 1895, the real revolutionary movement kicks off. It is spearheaded by a man named Jose Marti, who is a very famous poet. He is a very famous revolutionary, a very famous activist, and he was living in Brooklyn at the time. He was kind of an expat of Cuba living in Brooklyn, and he saw kind of the perils of Spanish rule in his young life. He saw the perils of Spanish rule with his friends. I mean, the big thing here is that the Cubans still had very little access to their own labor production, right? They were producing all this sugar, but it always went to Europe. All of the money was being made by Europeans for Europeans. There was no money coming into Cuba, and the people of Cuba were still suffering. So this is a labor movement more than anything. And Jose Marti had studied very extensively the 10 Years' War, and he had come to that conclusion that we just talked about, that it was just disjointed, that it was just disorganized. And he believed that if you could organize a similar movement and you could fight a similar war, but you had cohesion and you had networks of people talking to each other and talking about who's going to fight who and who's going to do what, that you could be successful. And so that's what he did. And so in 1895, he took off from Brooklyn with a couple other revolutionaries and went back down to Cuba. And from there, they incited a massive slave rebellion, a massive revolution throughout the countryside. And they fought a dead and bloody war with the Spanish. The Spanish responded. The Spanish did not give this up very easily. They call this the reconcentración that happened in Spain, because Spain sent 40,000 soldiers to quell the Cuban Revolution. and they started to attack Cubans very indiscriminately within Cuba. They issued a mandate that was a week long. They said, if you are not a revolutionary, you need to come into one of the city centers within the next week. Anybody outside of any of the major city centers, so Havana, Santiago, a couple cities in Cuba, anybody outside of those city centers is going to be considered a revolutionary and they will be murdered. This is what happened in Cuba. This is a man sitting on a pile of bones. 480,000 Cubans were massacred in the Spanish Reconcentracion. It was a devastating time. They had concentration camps. They had rampant disease because the cities were overpopulated. It was an extremely dark time in Cuba. But the Spanish very quickly realized that they were only controlling the cities, that most of Cuba at that point was out of their control. The United States was keenly watching what was happening on its borders. We were keenly watching the situation develop within Cuba. And we saw an opportunity. We saw Spanish weakness as the United States opportunity. And the United States started to kind of insert themselves in this conversation. One big part of this was the journalism that was going on at the time. We call this yellow journalism. And yellow journalism was, major publications publishing essentially what politicians wanted them to publish to influence U.S. opinion. The Spanish were the Spanish response to the Cuban Revolution was so devastating, and there was so much news coming out of Cuba that they were massacring Cubans and that they were slaughtering all these people and that there was rampant poverty. The United States public opinion of Spain was at its lowest point. We were bashing Spain left and right, and we were trying to develop kind of a national sentiment within the United States such that the United States could be justified in intervening in Cuba. The United States sent down one of our battleships. It was the USS Maine, down in the middle of the war. And ostensibly, or towards the end of the war, it was about 1898, we sent the Maine down to Cuba. Ostensibly, the mission was to extract U.S. nationals from Havana and bring them home. This was the stated mission of this event. But the Maine, when it was on the Cuban coast, was mysteriously exploded. And it was drowned, and 280 American soldiers died in the downing of the USS Maine. Now, the USS Maine is controversial to this day, and we have more documents coming out all of the time that say that this was probably orchestrated by the United States. We, at the time, said that the Spanish shot down the USS Maine. That is likely not what happened. This was a false flag event, and the United States sank their own ship in order to justify popular opinion switching in the United States. Teddy Roosevelt came out after this event happened and he said, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." And he started to galvanize support for intervention in Cuba. Now the Cubans are still fighting their revolution, and the Cubans are fighting for Cuban revolution, but the United States sees opportunity, and the United States wants to co-opt the revolution because that would mean that the United States would have prioritized interests in Cuba in the next years. So the United States did invade in 1898 after the USS Maine and after Teddy Roosevelt had gone back to Congress for support in the war. We landed on Guantanamo Bay. We still control Guantanamo Bay today. But the United States quickly did co-opt that revolution, and we quickly swept across the entirety of the country, into Havana, into Santiago, into the major city centers, and we took out the Spanish very, very quickly in the Spanish-American War. So this war was not ultimately decided by the Cubans, and this has always been a sticking point for the Cubans, because they wanted to fight this war. They did not necessarily want U.S. intervention. We gave that intervention very willingly, without very much requests from the Cubans, because they wanted to control their country. And that was the big fear that they had, was that they would not be able to control their resources. They would not come away with this, with a united, sovereign Cuba. So this was the big question. And in 1904, the United States issued what we called the Platt Amendment. And the Platt Amendment was a stipulation to Cuba that basically said, It basically said the United States has a right to intervene in any Caribbean state and any surrounding state, should we see the need for it. And this was a big portion of the Platinum. And it was a big part of the deal that we gave to Cuba. When we said we would protect them, we said that we would take care of them, we would preserve their independence. If you do X, Y, and Z, if you give us kind of prioritized control of sugar plantations, if you let our merchants come in and take over all of those plantations that the Spanish were running, we just attached all sorts of strings to the deal of Cuban independence. So Cuba was not really free and never has been truly free unless we kind of count the Castro years. So this has always been a major fear in Cuban life, is what is the United States going to do? We are so close to the United States. Are they going to intervene at any given time? And this is a lot of Cuba's foreign policy, is trying to push back against having a major imperial power 90 miles to your north. In steps this man right here, Gerardo Machado. He would rule the country from 1925 to 1935, and he's going to be the country's first dictator. They had kind of this 20-year period after things where they were negotiating how they were going to assert themselves on the international stage. And this man came through and really consolidated power, and not necessarily in a good way. He won his first election, and he was extremely popular. But as he was leaving office, one of his mandates, he didn't want to leave office, basically. And he basically took this new constitution that they had and said, what is this term limit thing doing in here? Let's get that out of here. And he tried to erase term limits from the Cuban constitution, which caused all sorts of problems. And ultimately, he was deposed in 1933 and overthrown by his people. They entered into a period of pretty proud expanded sovereignty. The United States revoked the Platt Amendment. Under FDR, we had the good neighbor policy, where we were going to treat our neighbors as sovereign countries. We were not going to intervene in them, and we were not going to maintain a right to intervene in them. This was a big push from FDR. And during this period, Cuba starts to have expanded sovereignty in their affairs. They start to see different political institutions arising. They start to really solidify their government from about 1934 to 1950, and things are looking up for Cuba at this point. In 1940, they elect this man, Fulgencio Batista. And Fulgencio Batista is a really interesting character in Cuban history. He was elected in 1940, and he served to 1944. That was his first election term, and he was an extremely progressive leader. One of the first things he did was to expand voting rights to black Cubans, to women Cubans. He invested heavily in literacy, invested heavily in healthcare. He was an extremely popular character from 1940 to 1944. But he came back in the 50s. And he came back an entirely different person in the 50s. And that's in large part because of what Cuba was in the 50s. So this whole period, the United States has a lot of different corporate partners operating in Cuba. We have a lot of different interests. We control most of the plantations. The United Fruit Company has their hands in everything in Cuba, and we have a lot of merchant interest in Cuba, and many Americans are getting extremely wealthy off the exploitation of Cuba and the Cubans. They called the 50s the gangster state in Cuba because it was run by mafiosos from the United States. Almost the entire government was extremely corrupt. They had this is where all the casinos in Havana come from. This is where all the nightclubs in Havana come from, all during this mob rule era. It's a very golden age, as many look back on it in Cuba, especially some of the expats that are in the United States, because some people were getting extremely wealthy, and Americans in particular were getting extremely wealthy during the 50s. But a lot of Cubans were struggling during the 50s, and there was huge income inequality within Cuba, and there was rampant frustration with the gangster state that was going on. And the government was not working for the people in many ways. So in comes this man, in comes Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro was born in 1926, and when he was very young, he married a young woman who was, I think she was full Cuban, but she had ties to the United Fruit Company. Her father had been working with the United Fruit Company. And the United Fruit Company, if you don't know about the United Fruit Company in Latin America, it was an atrocious corporation that ran many of the fruit plantations throughout Latin America. And they were a militant operation too. I mean, if labor ever spoke out against the United Fruit Company, they slaughtered them. And this was a case that happened throughout Latin America, was that the United Fruit Company had their own little militia, and they would send them in to kill their workers if they weren't doing exactly what they wanted them to. So the United Fruit Company was extremely evil. And Fidel Castro, in his 2 years of marriage to this woman, got very close to the United Fruit Company, and he saw what they were doing in Cuba. And he became very, very disenchanted with the status quo in Cuba. And he became very, very disenchanted with American corporate interests running all of Cuba. He was arrested in 1956, I believe, and after having tried to start his first revolution. Fidel Castro had launched an initial revolution prior to the major Cuban Revolution, and it was a total dud. It was probably 100 people. They went into the woods, and they were totally unsuccessful, and ultimately he was captured. But when he was captured, he gave about a 2-hour speech. I don't know why they let him do this. But he gave a 2-hour speech called History Will Absolve Me, and they turned it into a book. And it became the rallying cry for Cubans everywhere. That spoke to the Cubans, and it said, I'm speaking out against these interests. I'm speaking out against corporations. I'm speaking out for the Cubans. And everybody got really, really excited about Fidel Castro. They got so excited that they started to put unilateral pressure on the Cuban government to release Fidel and Raul Castro, which they did, and pretty immediately regretted, because they are going to come back very quickly, and they are going to start what would ultimately be what we consider the Cuban Revolution. Fidel Castro was exiled for a number of years. In exile, he went to Mexico, and he met Che Guevara. He met some of the other revolutionaries there, and they started to develop a coalition of leaders, as well as galvanizing support within the country. They used their networks from afar for a couple of years prior to actually coming back to Cuba and starting their guerrilla war. The Cuban Revolution was entirely a guerrilla war. They were armed very sparsely. They were very, very small bands of revolutionaries. When Castro and Che Guevara came back, they started this thing from the ground up, and they just started collecting workers from all over, and they started taking them into the mountains, into the Sierra Maestra, and they started taking them into the forests, and they tried to teach them how to live in these forests and how to ambush invaders. And they ultimately started becoming pretty successful within the revolution. Keep in mind, they were not as successful as we paint them to be. The United States actually had a huge role in painting this revolution as far more successful than it was going to be. One key part of that is that Cuba was never on the USSR's radar. We always think of Cuba as maybe having a USSR-backed revolution. The USSR barely knew who Cuba was when this revolution was happening. So the revolution does happen, and it takes place in a series of very bloody, very strange battles being fought throughout the entire country by different bands and led by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. And in 1959, they ultimately stormed into Havana and took over the presidential seat within Havana. And they kicked out Batista. They kicked him out. He actually fled, and he came to the United States and lived for the rest of his life. But this is when the revolution really took over, and everybody was extremely, extremely excited about the revolution. This was a big deal in Cuba because this was going to be the first times that Cubans actually ran the Cuban government. They had 3 days of celebrations when this happened, and they celebrated this for a very long time. Everybody was wondering what kind of leader Castro would be. Nobody really knew, and Castro had projected himself as fairly benevolent. He had projected himself as a man of the people. But one of the first things that Castro did was he killed dissidents. So he automatically kind of took to fear very quickly. And in the days following the revolution, he executed about 3,200 nationals in public arenas to kind of put the fear of God in the Cuban people, which was to say that you either get in line or you shut up or you die. And so it already had kind of authoritarian undertones. And in many ways, his government was fairly authoritarian. The United States didn't know what to do with Fidel Castro. We had no idea what to do with Cuba at this point. We were extremely frustrated with Cuba in the wake of the revolution because that did threaten a lot of U.S. interests. And one of the other first things that Castro did was take away that land from wealthy Americans and give it back to Cubans, and take away those plantations from the United Fruit Company and other corporations and give them back to the Cubans. So everybody here was pretty upset with what was happening in Cuba already. And we started to think about what we're going to do with this guy. In comes the Bay of Pigs. And the Bay of Pigs is one of the biggest blemishes in American history because we ostensibly went into Cuba to overthrow Fidel Castro. What happened in reality was there were about 1,200 expats who had armed themselves in the United States. The United States provided quite a bit of military support, and we said that we will send you back fully armed, and you will take Havana, and it will be this big triumph, and everybody will be happy, and we'll restore order in Cuba. What actually happened is that Fidel Castro was tipped off about the event. He knew it was going to happen. They were laying in wait when they actually docked on the southern side of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, and they slaughtered the incoming force. I mean, they killed about 82 of them, but they captured almost all of them. They were political prisoners, and many of them were executed very shortly after in Havana for their discretions. In this way, Castro also proved himself extremely worthy. This is extremely important to these kinds of events. When you go in and you say, I'm just going to take out this petty dictator and they can't fight me, I'm the United States, I have all these weapons, and then somebody beats you, you start to look really bad and they start to look really good. So Castro is going to rise in popularity and pretty exponentially as a result of this. But another thing happens with that. Castro has now kind of signaled to the USSR that he is a viable ally. The USSR, again, did not have any thoughts of Cuba when this revolution was happening. They had no idea that Cuba could potentially be their ally. They had given up on the idea that they would have any sort of territorial control in the Western Hemisphere. And in doing so, they basically signaled to the USSR that they needed help and that they were friends. Very quickly, Fidel Castro declared Cuba a socialist country. And the USSR got in there very quickly and started to help out with Castro. And this is Khrushchev and Castro. This is Kennedy signing the embargo in 1961 that is still in place today. This was supposed to starve Cuba. This was supposed to make it nearly impossible for Cuba to live and exist. Only then did Cuba turn to the USSR. We talked about this in Venezuela too. We talk about these countries being these horrible socialist nations that ally themselves with Russia and all these things, but we very much push them into the arms of the Russians, and we always have to be cognizant of that. So everything changes when they start to get USSR support, and they start to become a relatively successful country. Where is this? I want to show you guys this. And the USSR starts to subsidize Cuba very, very heavily. Cuba has a lot of sugar, and sugar is very popular in the USSR. The USSR has a bunch of food problems going on through their history. And so to have a resource like Cuba sending sugar constantly and sending some of these other goods was extremely advantageous to them. And in return, the USSR sent money and they sent oil. And they turned on the tap for Cuba, and Cuba became very, very successful very quickly, and they had injections of about $6 billion a year coming from the USSR throughout the period of the entirety of the USSR. During that time, Castro invested extremely heavily in really ambitious social programs. He worked very hard on their healthcare system, and their healthcare system quickly became one of the best in the world. Cuba still today has one of the highest literacy rates in the world. It's like 99.4%. And that was all because of Castro's big initiatives. I mean, their literacy rate before this was in the 30s and 40s. They had half the population who could read. And Castro started to implement programs around hunger, started to implement programs around health, he started to implement programs around education. And Cuba experienced a relatively good moment. But they were always kind of under threat from the United States. And so in 1962, we had another brush with Cuba, which was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the Cuban Missile Crisis was all about the Soviets had put nuclear missiles in Cuba. And now we had nuclear missiles 90 miles away from the United States. This is a big part of much of the debate around nuclear missiles right now. There's kind of two components of the nuclear debate. One is if you have the ability to build a nuclear bomb. Can you refine enough uranium to build a bomb? Can you build a bomb? Do you have the technology to build a bomb? The second is the rockets. Most countries do not have access to what we call intercontinental ballistic missiles. They do not have rockets that can shoot to the United States. The United States, again, is powerful. We have two oceans on either side of us. No missiles are getting to us. There's tons of time, and there's very few countries that have that capability. So Cuba, being about 90 miles away, 90 miles is a far shorter distance to travel than across the Atlantic Ocean. And so when the USSR instilled missiles there, it was a major, major threat to the United States. We only discovered these kind of by accident. We had a plane flying over, they were taking random pictures, and this picture came back. And it showed all of the missiles and all of the deployment mechanisms that were existing in Cuba at the time. And the United States got very, very nervous very, very quickly. And this is probably the closest that the world has ever been to nuclear war. There was 13 days in October where the United States and Cuba were engaged in very, very tense discussions. We were eye to eye, as they said, and then we said that the Soviets blinked. But in reality, we kind of both backed down. The Cubans did not have a lot of say in this debate. It was mostly a discussion that was being had between the USSR and the United States. We made a deal. The United States also had nuclear missiles in Turkey. We said that we would take our missiles out of Turkey if they took their missiles out of Cuba. And ultimately, that is what we landed on. Fidel Castro was extremely upset about this. Fidel Castro wanted those nukes because this means protection. This means that the United States is not going to come invade your country. If you have a nuclear weapon, the United States is far more likely to stay out of your country. So he was extremely upset, and he felt really disregarded because ultimately that negotiation was between the USSR and the United States. And again, Cuba kind of feels hard done by. I mean, it's their territory, it's their missiles. Why are you talking to the USSR when you should be talking to me? But ultimately, they got out of there. Very, very tense moment for the entire world. Cuba has experienced a couple waves of emigration, people leaving Cuba throughout history. One of those was the freedom flights that came right in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Fidel Castro issued a mandate to all of Cuba, and he said, you can leave. If you're not in line with this revolution, go to the United States, get out of here, I don't care. I only want people who are going to be backing me. And so the United States actually landed a bunch of planes, and we had freedom flights that flew out of Cuba and into the United States. Now, this is what is very confusing about much of the conversation that we've been having about Cuba for the past few decades, is that most of the people who left were wealthy Cubans. They were very conservative Cubans. They were Batista loyalists. They may have had vested interests in those plantations, and they were making a lot of money. These were the wealthy people. Most of the Cubans that landed in Miami are conservative Cubans. There are a host of liberal leftist Cubans that stayed in Cuba. But most of the conversation that we have on the U.S. political sphere is very informed by those conservative Cubans. Marco Rubio is the son of one of these Cuban expats, and he's extremely conservative as a result of it. All of the Cubans that landed in Miami were essentially persecuted by their government for being conservative. So most of the people here are conservative, and we get a distorted view of it. Same with Venezuela. Most of the people who have left Venezuela hated Maduro, and if you ever talk to Venezuelans here, they hate Maduro, but it's a distorted picture of the actual opinion of these guys. So just be wary. I mean, there's just no blanket, like, Fidel Castro was great or Fidel Castro was evil. There's no blanket, Nicolas Maduro was great, Nicolas Maduro was evil. Don't fall into that trap. The Cuban model also took after the Soviet model. They kind of exported their system of markets. And they had what was called the libreta system. So for most of the length of the USSR, the era of the USSR, Cuba operated much the same way as the countries within the USSR. It was never fully incorporated into the USSR, but it was brought on as a major trading partner for the USSR. And they had a rationing system. And they had kind of, government controls everything. It was a government-controlled economy. Government brings in the food, government brings in the medicine, government brings in everything that you need. You report to the government and you say, I'm diabetic, so I'll need insulin, I'll need rice, I'll need flour, I'll need these things, and the government gives you vouchers for those things, and you take those vouchers to a store and you get your thing. That was the Soviet model, and that's how most Soviet countries acted during this time, is that they were issued vouchers by the government. You could sell your voucher if you wanted, or you could go get what was actually owed to you. We criticize this very much on our side because it's very antithetical to the American way of, like, you should just be able to have whatever you can afford and nobody should tell you what you can and can't buy. But it was a fine system for a number of years up until the Soviet collapse. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there is probably no country that suffered more than Cuba, because Cuba lost all of its oil, it lost all of its security, it lost all the $6 billion a year of funding. Cuba was gutted when the Soviet Union fell, and it hit their economy crazy, crazy hard. In the 90s, the Cuban GDP shrank by 40% in just a couple of years in the wake of the USSR. They also experienced rampant stagflation and inflation because they kept spending on a lot of these social programs. They still had all of these hospitals to uphold and all of these education institutions that they had built to uphold. And so they kept spending money at the same time to keep those things going while not having anything to back it up. And ultimately their economy took a tank. This was extremely exciting for the United States. The United States likes to see Cuba suffer because it means that we are closer to taking over Cuba. And so we were thrilled with what was happening, but it was an extremely dark period for Cubans, and many Cubans starved during that period. They called this the special period. And they still call this a special period, and it kind of changed the way that Cubans live and work. If you go to Cuba today, you'll see a lot of urban farms. You'll see people growing their own food because there's no food coming in. And so most of the food that people are eating, they're growing on the rooftops of Havana. They're growing throughout the city. I mean, it is a totally kind of unconventional economy as a result of the special period. And they really didn't know what they were going to do. Fidel Castro was not going to give up his seat. Fidel Castro was going to be in charge until his death. And it was a really hard time from 1991 to 1999. But in 1999, this man was elected, Hugo Chavez, in Venezuela. And Venezuela had the oil that Cuba needed. The entirety of the Cuban grid runs on oil. It is an extremely antiquated electric grid. Most of their services run on oil. All of the food that moves through the country needs oil and gas to get to where it needs to go. So in the special period, as with today, they are struggling immensely over a lack of oil and a lack of gas. Fidel Castro, or Chavez, could offer that to Cuba. And in 1999, when he was elected, he quickly reached out to Castro because one of the problems that Venezuela faced was that they had really poor health care. Cuba had really good health care and some of the best doctors in the world. So in exchange for oil, Cuba sent doctors to Venezuela. And Venezuela sent boatloads of oil into Cuba and rescued their economy in the early 2000s. This existed until about 2006. In 2006, Castro was facing health problems. And he gave over his seat to his brother, Raul Castro. Raul Castro was very much his brother's keeper. I mean, he was part of the revolution. He was a great revolutionary. It was nice to turn things over to a family member, I suppose. Castro was facing a whole bunch of issues. And this man ruled for about 12 years. He did preside over some economic liberalization. He opened Cuba quite a bit. I mean, quite a bit more than I think even Fidel Castro was anticipating. He is the one who brought Obama to Cuba and started the process that we had going prior to the first Trump administration, which was to liberalize our approach towards Cuba, to start to lift those embargoes, to start to lift all of the sanctions that we had put on Cuba. So he actually had a pretty ambitious kind of economic plan for Cuba that was not necessarily purely socialist in any ways. Fidel dies in 2016, and it was a very sad moment for many Cubans. For other Cubans, it was a moment of rejoice. Again, people were very divided about Fidel Castro, but we're kind of in this post-Castro period right now, and this is the first we're really seeing of it. So Raul Castro leaves office in 2018, and this man takes over. He was deputized by Raul Castro. He was very much his vice president of sorts throughout the time, and he's the president today, Miguel Diaz-Canel. He is a revolutionary, kind of, but he hasn't been able to do much since 2019. Cuba has been in a dire situation the entire time that he has been in office, and it's only really gotten exacerbated later, or in the past year or so. So we don't even know what this guy would do if he was allowed to do anything. I mean, Trump came into power in his first term very quickly in 2017, right? And he put the kibosh on everything that Obama was doing very, very quickly as he took office in his first term. And he put all the sanctions back on. He added some more sanctions to that, and he put the embargo back. So this guy has really not had any chance to shine, and we don't necessarily know what he's willing to do, but he's not willing to give up power. We do know that he will not give up power, and that he is ready to fight at any step. So we've entered a new phase of Cuban relations that looks the same as many of the old phases, but it's very, very intense right now. They call this the maximum pressure strategy. As of February of this year, right after we ousted Maduro, we put a naval blockade around Cuba. We have not let any ships come into Cuba or leave Cuba, and no oil has come into Cuba. There was one Russian tanker that got through about a month ago, and they are entirely out of oil. We are starving Cuba. We are laying siege to Cuba in modern terms. And it's a very, very aggressive and very intense policy at the hands of the United States. We have a couple battleships in and around Cuba. We have two of our major battleships, the USS Iwo Jima, and I forget which one the other one is. But these they're not necessarily our big aircraft carriers that we are sending to the Middle East, but they're the miniature version of those. They still have a lot of planes on them. They still have a lot of war machines on them. And we have talked, at least at the federal level, very much about a Cuban invasion and about taking over Cuba in some way, shape, or form, whether that is friendly or whether that is military takeover. Donald Trump was saying that we're going to have one of those aircraft carriers just pop by Cuba and take care of things really quick on its way home. This is a very, very real scenario for Cubans, and it's very, very real for us. This is something that will likely happen because it is so weakened. They were extremely weakened when we ousted Nicolas Maduro. That was their oil lifeline. They got oil from Venezuela and they got oil from Mexico. The United States basically put a ton of pressure on Mexico as well to stop trading with Cuba. Mexico has not traded with Cuba at all this year because of U.S. pressure on them. We took out Nicolas Maduro, so they are getting no oil into the country. They reported last week that they are completely out of oil, just totally out of oil. They are experiencing the largest migration wave in their history. We don't even know how many people they are losing, but it is upwards of about 800,000 people that we know of in just this wave. And it's a population of 100 million people. That's 10% of your population is fleeing or trying to flee. in many ways. These are some of the other waves of immigration. We have the post-revolution exodus, when Castro got into power, Batista loyalists fled, the freedom flights that we talked about, and then there's been a couple other events where people have been able to leave the country. But many of these people are leaving now. This was 21 to 24. We are in 2026 now, and this number has shot way up in the last couple of years. And in the last couple months, people are fleeing en masse. The grid is done for in March 18th of 2026. The grid initially collapsed. People are living in blackout. Up until recently, it was about 20 hours a day of blackout. Today, it is probably entirely blackout. There's no refrigeration. There is no cars moving. There is nothing going on in that country. If you are a diabetic and you need insulin refrigerated, you are out of luck. If you need medical procedures, you are pretty out of luck. They say that there have had 100,000 surgeries performed by cell phone light in Cuba in the last year. It is a dire, dire situation in Cuba, and it looks like we are going to intervene finally. And we are going to say that this was a humanitarian intervention, and look at what their government did to them. They're doing surgeries by candlelight. We did this. We've done this. We've been strategically weakening them. We've been starving them so that they are excited for us to take over. This is what we did in Venezuela. This is what we're doing here. It's a tense situation. Many Cubans are calling for U.S. intervention at this point because the situation is so dire. That is something you will see in your news media, is that people are excited about the U.S. coming in. And ultimately, hopefully we do come in and save people, or we let oil through. But something has to give. And they cannot live in this situation for much longer. This will happen in the next couple of weeks. We will see what changes in Cuba. The current kind of outline of things is that Marco Rubio has been having covert discussions with some of the Cuban leaders. They are in a similar situation to what we're in with Iran, where we don't even know who we're talking to, and some people tell us good things, and some people tell us things that we don't want to hear, and so it's very muddled and confusing. So Marco Rubio is trying to debate with basically opposition leaders who don't run the government, but trying to find a way probably to have some sort of insurrection or takeover. That could be something that happens. We could fully invade Cuba. We could bomb Cuba. We'll see what happens. But we have been trying to starve them into surrender. And Canal, the current leader, Miguel, has said he won't surrender. And he said that he is ready to fight. And all of the declarations that he has made in about the last week are about how Cuba is ready to fight and how they are armed for this fight, and how they believe that it will be a major, major mistake for the United States to invade Cuba because they are so ready to fight. That's probably not true. They probably don't have a lot of guns, and they certainly don't have a lot of fuel for their vehicles. And that it's going to be very hard to fight a military operation without gasoline. So they are pretty ripe for the takeover. It's probably something that will either take over or will put the people that we love in power and rule from afar. But we'll see what happens, continuing to unfold. But keep an eye on it this week. This week is going to be huge. Next week is going to be huge for what happens with Cuba going forward. And they can't live like this quite that much longer. A little bit of a depressing end. Any questions from you guys?
Painful.
It is. It is painful. It's important to see what we're doing, though. As I said, this is part of a larger strategy. And it's an antiquated kind of... It's something that European leaders did throughout the 1600s and 1700s, was just get as much territory as possible, try to get as many resources as possible. I mean, this is also human history, right? Is exploiting countries and taking their resources, and we're not the first people to do this by any stretch. Yep.
I think you did a fantastic job.
Thank you.
I know more now about Cuba than I've ever known in my whole life. Every part of it. So it's really amazing to know what you provided us with. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much. Thank you guys. Yeah. Happy to answer any other questions. All right. Well, thank you guys so much. It's great to see you. You like that one?
Terrific.
Yeah, thank you.
Painful, but terrific.
Yeah. Be very interesting to see what happens. It's a beautiful place, though.
It is.
And they have such beautiful culture, so much good jazz, so much good cigars, good rum, good drink. Yeah, it could be such a nice place if we let it. Yeah, right.